Today's story begins in the middle of a city torn apart by protests, racism, and misunderstanding. But one woman is about to change everything. A black army colonel, with a past darker than most could ever imagine, is about to face a group of racist cops who have no idea who they're dealing with. The camera lingers on the woman, showing her calm yet resolute demeanor. They thought they could intimidate her, but they had no idea. She's no ordinary woman. She's a trained Army Ranger. The scene shifts, showing officers moving towards her, unsure of what to expect next. Stay tuned to see what happens next. And don't forget, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that'll keep you at the edge of your seat. The air was thick with tension as the sound of the bustling airport echoed through the terminal. Travelers hurried past, oblivious to the scene unfolding in the corner near the security check. At the center of it all stood Colonel Alicia Graves, a black woman in her late 30s, her uniform crisp and polished, a quiet strength radiating from her every movement. She was no ordinary woman. Alicia had served in the Army Rangers for over a decade, earning the respect of her peers and commanders alike. Her reputation was built on precision, skill, and a relentless drive to protect her country, no matter the cost. But today, none of that mattered to the two officers standing in front of her. The first officer, a tall white man with a broad frame, scanned her with suspicion. He adjusted his badge and sneered, glancing at his partner, a shorter officer who was busy scribbling something in his notebook. "Excuse me, ma'am," the first officer said, his tone condescending. "You're going to have to step aside. We need to check your bags." Alicia felt her jaw tighten, but she remained calm. She knew better than to lose her composure. It wasn't the first time she had been targeted by people who judged her based on her race. What she didn't expect, however, was the blatant disregard for her uniform and the authority it commanded. "I've already been through security," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Is there an issue?" The shorter officer looked up from his notebook, sneering. "You're just another one of those people who think they can bypass the rules because of their fancy uniforms. Move it." Alicia stood her ground. "I've been through the procedures, officer. I'm not moving until you explain why I'm being detained." The taller officer stepped closer, his stance intimidating. "You're being detained because we say so. Now, you'll do as you're told." The air was thick with hostility, the crowd around them growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. Alicia could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her, but she refused to back down. She had seen enough of this type of treatment in her career, but today it was different. She was prepared to confront it head-on. Without warning, the taller officer moved forward, grabbing her arm roughly. "I said move." Alicia's hand shot out, gripping the officer's wrist with precision. With a twist, she forced him to release his hold. The officer stumbled back, shocked by her strength and control. "Don't touch me," Alicia said coldly, her voice steady and controlled, like a soldier giving orders on the battlefield. "I don't take orders from you." The officer's face reddened with anger. "You're not above the law, ma'am. I'll have you arrested for assault." Alicia's eyes narrowed, her military training kicking in. She knew she couldn't let this escalate further. But the officers were relentless, their egos bruised by the unexpected resistance from someone they had underestimated. The situation was spiraling, and she had no intention of letting them take advantage of her. "Stop," the shorter officer barked at his partner, noticing the growing tension in the air. "Let's just check her bags and be done with it." Alicia didn't trust them. She didn't trust their motives, and she didn't trust their judgment. They had made it clear from the beginning that they saw her as just another black woman in their way, a nuisance to be handled, not a person to be respected. But Alicia wasn't going to let that slide. She had served this country with honor, had fought battles that most would never understand, and today she wasn't about to let these racist officers tarnish everything she had worked for. "I'm not going anywhere," she stated firmly, "not until I speak to your superior." The taller officer's patience snapped. "You want to talk to my superior?" he scoffed. "Fine, but I'll make sure your day doesn't go the way you think." He reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the button. Alicia's mind raced. She knew that calling for backup would only escalate things, and she wasn't going to allow herself to be dragged away without a fight. In one fluid motion, Alicia grabbed her phone from her pocket and hit a speed dial number. She held the phone to her ear as the officer continued to shout orders at her. The line clicked as it connected, but Alicia remained calm, ignoring the commotion around her. "Hello?" A voice answered on the other end. It was General Maxwell, her commanding officer. Alicia didn't waste time with pleasantries. "General, I need backup. I'm at the airport, and I'm being harassed by two officers. They're targeting me because of my race." The line was quiet for a moment. Alicia could hear the general's deep breaths on the other end. "Stay calm, Colonel." General Maxwell said. "We're sending someone immediately. Don't engage any further. I'll handle this." The words were like a weight off her shoulders. She had the support she needed, but she also knew that the officers weren't going to back off easily. As she ended the call, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The tension was palpable. The officers' smirks faltered, and their eyes flickered to one another, uncertain. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The tension in the air grew thick as the officers stood frozen, their gaze flickering between Alicia and the phone she had just put down. They hadn't anticipated the phone call. They hadn't expected her to have a direct line to someone who could counter their power, someone who would make them question their authority. Alicia stood tall, her posture unwavering, her heart beating steadily. She wasn't just a black woman. She wasn't just an army officer. She was a force in her own right, and she wasn't going to let two racist officers dictate how her day would end. Her grip on the situation was firm, but her mind raced as she anticipated the next move. The taller officer, still trying to regain his composure, sneered at her, his voice laced with venom. "Do you think calling your superior is going to change anything? You're still under arrest for resisting?" Alicia didn't flinch. "I'm not resisting. I'm asserting my rights. There's a difference." The officer's jaw tightened, his patience running out. But before he could respond, the radio on his belt crackled, followed by a voice from dispatch. "Officer Clark, Officer Simmons, stand down. Backup is on the way. We've received a call from General Maxwell himself." The mention of General Maxwell's name hit the officers like a freight train. They both knew the power that came with that name. General Maxwell was a high-ranking officer in the military, and if he was involved, things were about to escalate in ways they hadn't imagined. For a moment, the two officers stood there, stunned, as they realized they were no longer in control of the situation. Alicia's calm demeanor, her unwavering authority, and now the involvement of General Maxwell were more than they could handle. Officer Simmons, the shorter one, glanced at his partner, clearly shaken. "What do we do now?" he muttered under his breath. Officer Clark, the taller one, swallowed hard and took a step back. "We wait," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He could feel the weight of their miscalculation bearing down on him. Alicia's eyes never left them as she stood firm, a sense of quiet pride settling in her chest. She had worked hard for the title of colonel, for the rank and the respect that came with it. But today the officers had disrespected her, and they would learn that they could not get away with it. The sound of footsteps approaching caught Alicia's attention. She didn't have to look to know it was her backup. She could hear the authority in their steps, military precision. Within moments, two men dressed in plain clothes, both exuding quiet strength and confidence, stepped into view. They were not just any officers. They were her military police backup, the type of people who had her back no matter what. The officers who had tried to intimidate Alicia now stood there, visibly sweating, unsure of how to handle the incoming reinforcements. "You're relieved of your duties here," one of the military officers said firmly, his voice laced with authority. "The colonel is under the protection of the military. You will stand down immediately." Officer Clark's eyes darted nervously between the military officers and Alicia. He had seen the look in their eyes, the kind of look that said this was no longer just a routine procedure. They were out of their depth. "You can't just come here and take over," Officer Clark protested, though his voice was shaky. "This is our jurisdiction." "No," Alicia interjected, her voice calm but commanding. "You've crossed the line, officer. This is no longer just about jurisdiction. You've threatened me, disrespected me, and now you'll face the consequences of your actions." The words hit harder than any physical blow. It wasn't just her military training that made her unshakable. It was the years of fighting for respect, fighting for recognition, and standing her ground against systemic injustice. Alicia knew how to stand up for herself in the face of authority, and now the tables had turned. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear and regret. He knew the implications of what had just happened. They hadn't just crossed paths with a black woman. They had crossed paths with an army colonel with more than enough backing to bring them down. The military officers, standing tall and unwavering, signaled for the officers to step aside. "We'll handle this from here. You're dismissed." The tension in the air began to dissipate as the officers reluctantly backed away. Their shoulders slumped, defeated. It was clear they weren't about to challenge the authority of the army, especially when their actions had drawn the attention of someone as powerful as General Maxwell. Alicia took a deep breath, her mind racing. She wasn't just relieved, she was empowered. She had stood up for herself, and she had turned the tables. The officers who had tried to bully her had been brought to their knees by her strength, her composure, and the weight of her experience. The military officers escorted the two defeated cops off the scene, leaving Alicia standing in the now quiet terminal. She knew the battle wasn't over. This wasn't just a one-time incident. But today she had sent a clear message. No one gets away with disrespecting her, not on her watch. As the last of the protesters were escorted away, Alicia stood in the middle of the airport terminal, her thoughts whirling. The immediate danger had passed, but her mind was already racing with the next steps. She had put the racist officers in their place, but this moment was only the beginning. There was much more to do. One of the military officers who had come to her aid approached, his face grave but respectful. "Colonel, we've secured the area, but this isn't over. We need to make sure this incident doesn't get swept under the rug." Alicia nodded, her jaw tightening as she absorbed his words. The whole reason she'd come to the airport today was to resolve a simple matter: catch a flight back home after a routine military operation. Instead, she'd been targeted by a couple of racially motivated officers. But what had started as a personal confrontation had the potential to explode into something much larger. The fact that she was an Army colonel only made the stakes higher. "I know," she replied, her voice firm. "We need to make sure the truth gets out, and I want to see those officers held accountable for what they did." The officer nodded. "We'll help you with that, but I think we need to take this to a higher level. We can't let them hide behind their badges." Alicia didn't need further convincing. Her military career had been built on the foundation of accountability and honor, two principles that seemed in short supply when it came to certain law enforcement officers. The sense of injustice was all too familiar for her. She had experienced it as a black woman climbing the ranks in a system that wasn't designed to uplift people like her. Today the officers had taken things too far, and she wasn't about to let them get away with it. "Set up a meeting with the internal affairs team," she instructed. "We'll take it from there." As she spoke, Alicia couldn't help but think back to the protest earlier. The moment she had turned the tables, when the officers thought they had control, only to realize they were in the presence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by standing up. Her dogs had played their part, but her true power came from the courage to fight back. She had felt the adrenaline surge when she'd pushed back, but she knew this wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, and her face hardened. It was a text message from General Maxwell, her commanding officer. "I've just spoken to the chief of police. They want to meet with you, now." Her heart skipped a beat. Alicia had been expecting this. She knew that things would escalate the moment she called for backup. But now it was clear. The police force was trying to downplay what had happened, trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. The fact that the general had intervened meant that the authorities were finally listening. The fight, however, was far from over. "I'll head over immediately," Alicia texted back. When Alicia arrived at the meeting room, she was greeted by a small but highly trained team of internal affairs officers. They were there to get to the bottom of the incident, and they had already begun gathering evidence. The room was filled with tension as officers from various departments, some familiar with Alicia's reputation, gave her respectful nods. But the chief of police, a middle-aged man named Chief Harrell, was already sitting at the table waiting for her. "Colonel Graves," Chief Harrell said, his tone professional but distant. "Please take a seat." Alicia sat down, her back straight and her expression unreadable. She was used to these types of meetings, where the system would try to protect its own, where the wheels of bureaucracy would attempt to spin in favor of those who held power. But she wasn't like other people. She had the courage to speak truth to power, even when it was uncomfortable. "I assume you've seen the footage," Alicia began, her voice sharp and commanding. The chief nodded, his gaze shifting to the officers behind him. "Yes, we've reviewed it. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is underway." Alicia fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had heard this line too many times. Officers placed on leave, investigations that never went anywhere, promises of accountability that amounted to nothing. But she wasn't going to let this one slide. "Administrative leave isn't enough," she said, her voice steady. "Those officers need to be held accountable for what they did. They need to answer for their actions, not just be put on pause. I want to see them charged." Chief Harrell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had clearly expected a more cooperative approach, but he should have known better than to think Alicia would back down now. "You know as well as I do, Colonel, that these situations are complicated," Harrell said, his tone dismissive. "There are legal processes that need to be followed. We can't just rush to conclusions." "No," Alicia said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "What's complicated is that a group of racist cops used their position of power to attack me. What's complicated is that they thought they could get away with it. And what's complicated is the fact that this type of behavior is systemic in a lot of places. We can't keep letting it slide." The chief looked down, clearly uncomfortable. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone as well-connected and respected as Colonel Graves. But Alicia was done playing nice. She wasn't just representing herself, she was representing every person who had ever been mistreated by the system. "We need to do the right thing," Alicia said, her voice quieter now, but just as firm. "And that starts with making sure these officers face real consequences." The conversation continued for another hour, with the chief offering little more than vague promises. But Alicia knew that this wasn't over. She had made her stance clear, and she wasn't going to stop fighting until those officers were held accountable. As she walked out of the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged. She had taken on the system before, and she would do it again. The air outside the meeting room was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Alicia Graves stood near the building's entrance, her mind swirling with thoughts of the upcoming battles she would need to face. The meeting with the chief of police had left her feeling both frustrated and determined. Though she had made her position clear, she knew it was just the beginning. The system would not be an easy adversary, but she had no intention of backing down. Her phone buzzed, bringing her back to the present. She pulled it out, her eyes quickly scanning the message. It was from General Maxwell. "The media has caught wind of the story. They're reaching out. They want you to make a public statement." Alicia's pulse quickened. She had known this moment would come, the moment when the spotlight would shine brightly on her actions. She had fought in the trenches before, but now, this was different. This wasn't just about one protester or a single incident. This was about exposing a deep-rooted issue, one that had been ignored for too long. She typed a quick response. "Tell them I'll do it. I'm ready." It wasn't long before she arrived at the press conference venue, a small conference room filled with reporters, cameras, and news outlets eager for answers. They had gathered in anticipation of her statement, and she could feel the weight of their eyes on her as she walked in, head held high, her military bearing evident. "Colonel Graves, thank you for speaking with us today." The lead reporter, a man in his late 30s, adjusted his glasses and gave a nod of respect. "We've seen the video, but we want to hear from you. What happened on that day at the airport?" Alicia stepped up to the podium, taking a deep breath before speaking. She could feel the weight of her uniform on her shoulders, but it was more than just fabric. It was the responsibility she carried, responsibility to herself, to her country, and to those who had been hurt by the injustice that still ran rampant in the system. "Thank you for being here," Alicia began, her voice strong, unwavering. "On that day I was targeted, not because of my actions, but because of my skin. I was met with hostility, not just from the protesters outside, but from members of law enforcement, officers who were supposed to serve and protect, but instead chose to discriminate." Alicia paused, letting her words sink in. She wasn't holding back, and she knew the media would report exactly what she said. "These officers used their position of power to harass and intimidate me, but they didn't expect me to fight back, to stand my ground, and they certainly didn't expect me to have the support and strength to ensure this issue wouldn't just be swept under the rug." The reporters were silent, scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Alicia's words were cutting through the noise, making their way into the hearts of everyone in that room. "But," Alicia continued, "this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been treated unfairly, who has been forced to endure a system that was not built for them. This is about the systemic racism that still infects every corner of this country. And if you think this is an isolated incident, you're wrong." Her gaze swept over the reporters, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was saying. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been silenced by the weight of discrimination. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice rising in intensity. "I will not stop until those officers are held accountable. I will not stop until we make sure that no one ever has to go through what I did." The reporters shifted uncomfortably, the force of her words rattling them. Alicia wasn't just another officer giving a statement. She was a woman with the courage to confront the system head-on, a woman with the power to bring real change. The cameras captured her every move, and her resolve would be broadcast to millions. One of the reporters, a young woman with dark hair and an inquisitive expression, raised her hand. "Colonel, what do you want to see happen next? What actions should be taken?" Alicia turned to face her, her expression resolute. "I want the officers involved to be held accountable. I want them to answer for their actions, to face the consequences of their discrimination. But beyond that, I want us all to start having these conversations. I want us to start acknowledging the real issues at play, and working toward real solutions." The room fell silent, the gravity of her statement hanging in the air. The reporters knew they had just witnessed a pivotal moment. It wasn't just about a single incident anymore. It was about the larger fight for justice and equality. and Colonel Alicia Graves was at the forefront of that fight. As the press conference came to an end, Alicia stepped down from the podium, her mind already on the next phase of the battle. The media frenzy would only continue to grow, but she was ready. She had taken the first step, but there was more work to be done. As she walked out of the room, a sense of resolve washed over her. This wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of every person who had ever been hurt by the system. The officers had tried to silence her, but now they had woken a sleeping giant. Alicia was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed, who had been ignored, and who had been kept down by the weight of a broken system. And she wasn't about to stop. The next few days were a whirlwind for Colonel Alicia Graves. The story of the confrontation at the airport had gone viral, plastered across news outlets, social media platforms, and television screens. People from all walks of life had come together, rallying behind her. But Alicia knew that the hard part was just beginning. The eyes of the world were on her now, and she would not let them down. Inside her office, Alicia sat, reviewing the reports from the Internal Affairs investigation. She could hear the steady hum of the city outside her window, but her focus was on the pages in front of her. The two officers involved in the altercation had been placed on administrative leave, but Alicia knew they had been given preferential treatment. That would have to change, and soon. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was General Maxwell. "Alicia, we've got word from the top. The police department's finally ready to take action. They've opened a full investigation into the officers involved. They're meeting with you tomorrow," Maxwell's voice said, full of urgency. Alicia's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. It was one thing to get the media's attention, but now it was about getting real change. She didn't need their apologies or promises. She needed real consequences for the officers who thought they could get away with their actions. "I'll be ready," Alicia replied, her voice calm but filled with determination. "I'm done waiting." The next day, Alicia arrived at the meeting, a sense of purpose in her step. The room was filled with officers from the department, including high-ranking officials who were finally ready to listen. The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders, but Alicia stood tall, unwavering in her resolve. The chief of police, Chief Harper, stood at the front of the room, his face a mask of professionalism, but Alicia could see the tension in his eyes, the discomfort at having to answer for the actions of his officers. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Colonel Graves, we understand the gravity of what happened," he said, his voice cautious. "The officers involved have been placed under investigation. We are taking your allegations seriously." Alicia didn't waste time with pleasantries. She had seen enough to know that words alone wouldn't be enough to bring about change. "I'm not here for apologies or half-hearted measures," Alicia said, her voice cold but controlled. "I'm here because these officers broke the law, and they need to be held accountable, just like anyone else who abuses their power." The room went silent, the air thick with tension. For a moment, Alicia thought the chief would try to deflect, to push back, but instead he nodded. "You're right," Chief Harper said, his voice resigned. "We'll be taking swift action. The investigation will continue, and disciplinary measures will be taken." Alicia's gaze never wavered. "I don't just want action. I want transparency. I want to know that this won't happen again, that no one else will have to suffer at the hands of these officers." The chief nodded again, this time with a hint of sincerity. "We'll make sure the process is transparent, and we'll work with the community to rebuild trust." Alicia wasn't satisfied, but it was a start. She had made her point, and now the real work began. Holding people accountable for their actions was never easy, but it was necessary. Later that evening, as Alicia sat alone in her office, reflecting on the meeting, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from General Maxwell. "The media's ready to report. They want you to make a statement tomorrow morning." Alicia stared at the message for a moment, then typed a quick reply. "Tell them I'll be there. We're not done yet." She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been wronged by the system. The fight for justice was far from over, but Alicia knew that as long as she kept pushing, as long as she kept fighting, change was possible. The next morning, Alicia stepped up to the podium at the press conference, her military uniform a reminder of her strength and resolve. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, waiting for her to speak. Alicia took a deep breath, her thoughts centered on the message she needed to send. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice strong and clear. "What happened at the airport is not just about me. It's about every person who has ever been unjustly targeted, every person who has been discriminated against, and every person who has been forced to endure the weight of systemic racism." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, hanging on to every word. These officers did not just violate my rights. They violated the rights of every citizen who believes in justice, fairness, and equality, and I will not stand by and allow them to go unpunished. I will continue to fight for what is right, no matter how difficult the road ahead may be. Alicia's eyes scanned the room, her gaze unwavering. I won't stop until every person who has suffered at the hands of injustice is heard. This fight doesn't end with one incident. It ends when we've dismantled the systems that perpetuate this hate. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Alicia felt the weight of the moment settle into place. She was making a difference, and she would continue to fight until justice was served.